Right, we are in chapter 11, no, 13. Pay attention to my notes today. We're on chapter 13 today. Just by way of a real simple review, and this is not all comprehensive, but now where are we in terms of Second Corinthians or First Corinthians? We've been looking at chapters 8 through 10 recently. And before then, we were at chapter 5 was about sexual immorality, 6 was about lawsuits, 7 about marriage, widows, divorced, believers married to unbelievers, and people who've never been married. And all those things have been important for us to understand because they're dealing with how Corinth should operate within the context of its neighborhood, its community. But we started getting into chapters 8 through 10, my rights. Uh, I should not be concerned about my rights. I will not be asked if I get to exercise my rights at the great judgment day. Thinking about weaker brother, about meat sacrificed to idols. Those were in chapters 8 through 10. In chapter 11, we started to transition to a new kind of theme about what does public worship look like for us. And you start to see that in chapter 11. We talked about head coverings and what was proper to wear, what was proper to do, and how do we do it. All these things matter because of the 6 reasons that Paul gives in chapter 11, verses 2 to 16. Chapter 17 to 34 was about the Lord's Supper. We looked at that a couple weeks ago. And last week we looked at chapter 12. We made it through, and this will be history for the people who are doing it now. But I got to about 10 minutes before the end of my Sunday school message and realized I'd forgot to start the microphone. So it was just a series of me talking like this, which may have been good for everybody's hearing. That's okay. Um, what's that? Uh, yeah, that'd be that would require me listening to myself or watching myself and then trying to syncopate that. And yeah, I can just have to re-record it. So we'll do that this week. So that was chapter 12. We looked at the beginning of chapters 12, 13, and 14 are about use of spiritual gifts. And that brings us to chapter 13 today. So we're going to look at that. Chapter 13 is about here's my outline for chapter agenda chapter 12. No, that's last week. Agenda chapter 13, 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 to 13. Love is the more excellent way. And Paul leads into this when he ends up chapter 12, and then he winds it up when he gets to chapter 14. So the bookends is really about what we've talked about before, how the bookends will help. So again, I'll have this outline. You won't have to worry about. I'll be repeating it if you're not seeing it. I could actually move out of the way too. I know some folks want to take pictures of it. So we're taking a look at these things. Illustrations of love from verses 1 to 3. 16 qualities of love in verses 4 to 8. Gifts that pass away in the last part of 8. Now and later, what happens now, what happens later in verses 9 to 13. And the greatest of these is love, pursue love. This is the concluding admonition. So let's look at the text together. Let's start with 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 to 3. Let's see. So illustration of love, verses 1 to 3. Now, you hear me say this a lot because it's important that we understand to drop in and parachute into chapter 13. We can do that, and many people have done that before, but I think that begins to help us misunderstand the purpose of chapter 13. So chapter 13, the context of it starts to wind up, right? I should say, to get wound up in verses 29 to 31 of the previous chapter. So 1 Corinthians 12, verses 29 to 31, all are not apostles, are they? All are not prophets, are they? All are not teachers, are they? All are not workers of miracles, are they? All do not have gifts of healings, do they? All do not speak with tongues, do they? Do they? All do not interpret, do they? And of course, these are rhetorical questions. The answer, which is expected, of course, is no. But earnestly desire the greatest gifts, the greater gifts. And yet, I'm going to show you a far better way. That's kind of your introduction to chapter 13. It's a far better way. Now we'll have some conclusions as we wind up about what this far better way is and how Paul's been bringing us to this conclusion. But we want to be able to see coming into it, Paul's trying to point out this gift of love that we have and how that's the better way beyond the actual gifts that are there. So we'll be taking a look at that today. So 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 to 3. If I speak with the tongues of mankind and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give away all my possessions to charity, and if I surrender my body so that I may glory, but do not have love, it does me no good. It seems to me that Paul is less concerned with the specifics of verse 1, that is, gifts of tongues known to mankind and tongues known to angels, or the specifics of verse 2, the gifts of prophecy that have this tremendous impact, or verse 3, the gifts of all my possessions to feed the poor. Paul seems to be answering an unstated question with each of these three examples. What's the result of having these gifts and not exercising them with love? Paul's made the point in chapter 12 that the purpose of gifts is to edify the body, not to edify me. The scenario that Paul seems to be addressing in this whole chapter, that when we use our gifts to advance a personal agenda or self-exaltation, the exercise of our gifts is actually worthless. As to the gifts he lists, these three things in verses 1, 2, and 3, he's referring to specific gifts, but he's actually using hyperbole to make a point. For instance, when he talks about the tongues of men and of angels, what's meant by that? Well, this is a reference back to chapter 12, verses 10 and 28. Gifts appointed by God and a portion, let's see, I actually have gifts appointed by God and apportioned out. So here, they're not just tongues of mankind, but also tongues of angels. Now, Paul's not saying that this is going on, but what he's saying is you've been given gifts of tongues to be heard by other people in their own language. There could be such a thing as understanding how the angels communicate. He's not saying that they're doing that, but he's saying this is what you've got. Imagine a greater gift of the same thing doing more than what you're doing. So he's using hyperbole to make the point. He's not saying they are talking in tongues of the angel tongue. He's saying, imagine if your tongue that you know that other men hear and hear there in their own language, imagine if it were greater than that. So he's trying to use hyperbole to make that point. So what's the result of having that gift and not exercising the gift in love? It's just noise. Anybody familiar with the Russian composer Shostakovich? That's just noise. If there's no love, love isn't binding the gifts together to work for the glory of God. The exercise of these so-called gifts would be called a performance. And the metaphor leads us to believe that it's just noisy, unpleasant performance. So they have these gifts and they're not using them in love, they're using to edify themselves, saying, I've got the greatest gift. Listen to me as I do these things. And so it's not leading to unity in the church, it's leading to disunity and noise, and an unpleasant noise at that. Now, we'll have more to say about tongues when we get into the middle of chapter 14, but suffice it to say they were speaking in tongues for all the right reasons, but all for the wrong reasons as well. The right reasons, and it was meant to be heard that God has something to communicate to someone in a known language, but they were doing it without love to puff up themselves. The second thing is there's a prophetic power, including mysteries, all knowledge and all faith. What are these? These are not just prophecies to the local church, but prophecies that include knowing all things. Have you ever met a prophet who knows all things? No. They know specific things about things that have been revealed to them just for the moment or just a time or just a church. And what Paul's doing is saying this gift of prophecies, if it's knowing all things, imagine if you had this gift of prophecy to your local church, but it wasn't just the local church, it was to all churches, it would be this big. Tongues this big, prophecies this big. And if you have prophecies that are this big, imagine the glory it would bring to yourself, and that's part of the problem. Because you're not using the gift now for love, you're using it to me, saying, look what a great gift I have. Knowing all things, having all faith, enough to really move mountains. And what's the result of having that, exercising that gift of prophecy of all things, and knowing all things, and moving mountains with all those things? I am nothing. And the third thing, then, to give away or deliver up. What are these? Not just helping people out a little here and there, or not just helping out people in the context of my local church, but helping out people everywhere because I've got enough money to do that. And I give it all away, and I get the glory for all that I gave away. Think of Ananias and Sapphira, everybody in the church like Ananias and Sapphira, taking all they have and giving it all away. And you might say, well, that's could be a good goal, but imagine again that you still have to live yourself, right? It's not wise to give away everything that you have. So, but they were trying to say, then these gifts, which are normal gifts or normative gifts, imagine them on steroids, and you have that, but if you don't exercise them in love for somebody else, it's an unpleasant sound. It doesn't bind things together. You're using them for your glory, and you become nothing. So that's what Paul's trying to say in verses 1 through 3. Not that the extension of all these gifts is normative. He's just saying, imagine if it were and they weren't in love, it would magnify the unpleasantness of it all. This hyperbolic description reaches to the heavens, not just our little church here. I may have the super gifts, I may have superpowers, but if it's without love, it's only a performance, and I'm nothing. So, of course, no one's ever exhibited these super gifts in this manner except God himself. One of the things I want you to notice is that Paul, when he gets done with these verses 1 through 3, he actually starts to switch to the first person, which begins to soften the illustration. So he's a little bit pointed in how he's beginning things. Again, picture someone leaving a little DNA on your sternum. Paul's softening that blow now when he comes down to saying these next several things, because they're all in the first person. All right, so that gets us through 1 through 3. Any questions about 1 through 3? Okay. All right, so that brings us to 16 qualities of love, which is verses 4 to 8. All right, love is patient. All right, so these are all, there are 15 verbs. The word rejoice is repeated twice, once in a negative sense and once in a positive sense. So 15 different verbs that Paul uses in these 4 sentences to describe what love is like in terms of quality. Love is patient. Love is kind. It's not jealous. Love does not brag. It's not arrogant. It does not act disgracefully. Does not seek its own benefit. It is not provoked. It does not keep an account of wrong suffered. It does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. It keeps every confidence. It believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. And I forgot the last piece. So again, in these four short verses, Paul uses 15 verbs in which love is the subject. So let's kind of walk through. I'll just leave this slide up. I didn't do any animation or anything like that. I just want you to be able to focus on that. So the idea of being patient and kind. We begin with 2 positive expressions of love through forbearance or patience and kindness. Patience is one of the relational attributes of God, sometimes called the communicable attributes of God. The other attributes are his essential attributes, those related to his essence, again, lately called incommunicable. We'll go through that definition and difference in the fall when we get to attributes of God and Trinity. But here he's just looking at the idea of what patience and kind does, because God has these attributes and he passes on to us being made in his image. Also think that these patience and kindness are actually part of the fruit of the Spirit. So when we exhibit them, we're calling upon the strength we've been given to be patient and to be kind, and that's the fruit of the Spirit that's happening. These 2 terms, because they are important, because they help us understand the 1 and 3 and the 3 and 1 aspects of the Trinity. God is patient and kind. And of course, we recognize that these are included in the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. You could make a case that the Galatians list, written very early in the church's life, is the first list, and this list is a broader list of what Christian walking in the Spirit exhibit. God's patience and his kindness is shown to men as he pursues and he leads mankind to repentance. And 2 things we can note about these 2 positive attributes, and I'm using Verlin Verbrugge's observations to help us with these 15 verbs. So I'm going to be repeating a similar kind of question for every one of these verbs. When we get to patience and kindness, we want to ask the question, or we want to make the statement, loving people are willing to tolerate the shortcoming of others because they know they have faults too. When we went through the Navigating Family Conflict series last fall, the first thing we want to be able to do in terms of our foundation of how to handle conflict is we want to glorify God. But remember the second thing? Here's your pop quiz for the day. Remember the second thing? You want to get the log out of your own eye. Before you go confront someone else, you need to examine your own heart, get the log out of your own eye, then you go to somebody else. And if you go to someone else without examining it, you run the risk of having it thrown right back in your face. And rightfully so. Right? When we unhumbly try to confront one another and we don't examine ourselves, we come with pride and arrogance, not with humility. So patience is actually an attribute closely related to humility. So loving people are willing to tolerate the shortcomings of others because they know they have faults too. Loving people treat others with respect and compassion, just as God treats us in that manner. Now, the converse is true too. What we know about love is that if we're not willing to tolerate the shortcomings of others, and if we don't treat others with respect and compassion, even though God does that for us, we have no love. Which is a harsh statement to say out loud if you think about it, but it should catch us by surprise, and it should catch us by the self-examination of where am I with God? Am I exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit or am I not? So that's patience and kindness. Love is not jealous, number 3. After the first 2, we now have 8 verbs which describe what love is not like and does not do. More importantly, this is a very specific list, likely because Paul has witnessed or has heard these improper actions amid the Corinthians. To summarize, the Corinthians were envious, boasting, arrogant, rude, self-seeking, easily offended, and looking to see and judge what others were doing. Does that sound like the kind of church you want to join? Does that sound like the kind of church you joined? No, the idea of being jealous is the first one, is not jealous, which is an intense negative feeling over somebody else's achievement. I hate that the other person was successful. I hate that they got good things coming to them, and I'm jealous that I didn't get them in the first place. Even to the point of being jealous over someone else's gifts. No, we want to ask the question, loving people are not envious or jealous of the success of other people. The next two go together, does not brag and is not arrogant. Loving people do not try to put others down by bragging about themselves. We call that narcissism, don't we? When the attention's all on me and never about you. Loving people do not try to put others down by bragging about themselves. That brings us to does not act disgracefully. That's number 6. So again, brag and arrogant, number 4 and 5 go together. Does not act disgracefully. Here the idea is not rude. It's used elsewhere in the New Testament, actually has sexual overtones, meaning the person's not crude, the person's not not respectful of other people's concerns. And so here the idea is loving people do not treat others indecently, sexually or otherwise. Yeah, we have noticed in the last 10 years or so a great deal of discussion about the Me Too movement coming to the church. And there's some both problems and some good things with that. At the same time, one of the things we haven't done is challenge ourselves really well about how are we doing about treating others indecently? How are we doing about treating others sexually or otherwise? Do we use words and phrases that mean something in a context, that we don't watch our words? But it's someone who acts disgracefully, is someone who brings shame on themselves for speaking about something inappropriately in a mixed content. Not that even amongst men or women that the same content's not inappropriate, but it's someone who doesn't really care what other people think. Number 7, doesn't seek its own way. Loving people do not attempt to advance their own interests, especially at the expense of other people's. How many times have you heard someone else make fun of somebody else? You crack a joke at the expense of someone else's esteem, either self-image or their self-esteem. Now, again, we'll have some other day, we'll talk about the evilness of self-esteem, which kind of tips my hand, doesn't it? of where we go with self-esteem. But when I begin to use somebody else for the butt of my jokes, or I begin to use somebody else for my own interest and at the expense of other people, I seek my own way. And Paul's saying that love does not do that. Number 8 is not provoked. Loving people do not have a sharp tongue that is ready to lash out at others at the drop of a hat. They don't have a hair trigger anger issue. Loving people don't have a sharp tongue. You know that when we go to, for instance, Proverbs chapter 12, it talks about the, I had a picture of everybody know what a claymore is? Okay, so some people, I've got a picture of a claymore when I was in Edinburgh this last time. The sword part of itself is almost 8 feet long. And the hilt, the handle, which is a great big long piece, is 3 feet this way and about another 2 feet either side this way. And so it's very much a it's a single person, two-handed sword, and it's meant not to tickle. It's not meant to encourage or strengthen. It's meant to wound and maim. And what Proverbs says is we sometimes use our words exactly like that. He calls them sword words. Words that are meant to hurt, meant to maim, meant to injure, meant to provoke. Instead of, as Proverbs then really alludes to, that person who does that's a fool, versus the person who looks to build up with their words, which is an example of love. So number 9, loving people. Let's see, love does not keep an account of wrong. Loving people do not keep bringing up past failures in an attempt to control others. Loving people do not bring up past failures in an attempt to control others. When I keep bringing things up over and over again, it's a sign that I have not forgiven. And if I have not forgiven, I do not love. Because to forgive is the promise, as we looked in our study on, again, family conflict. When I promise to forgive, what I'm promising to do is not bring it back to others, not bring it back up to you, not bring it back up to myself, and even not to bring it back up to God. That's what forgiveness means. And yet when we keep bringing it back up over and over and over again, you've said, I really didn't forgive. And that's not loving. It is not love. Number 10, not rejoicing at unrighteousness. Loving people do not rejoice when they see people doing wrong things, so that they keep bringing up such deeds to blackmail them. There's a German word for that. Well, Simon's not in here today. Schadenfreude. Everybody heard of Schadenfreude? Taking pleasure at someone else's misfortune. You see YouTube videos like this, or TikTok videos, or Instagram videos all the time, like instant karma kinds of things. When well, I won't go through the illustrations, but the idea that someone got what was coming to them based on what they just did, and we kind of snicker when that happens, don't we? Right? When so and so gets out and yells at somebody in the car, and they get back in their car and pull out and then hit somebody or get hit by somebody because they're not paying attention. That's Schadenfreude, and we snicker, but that has no place in God's kingdom. It has no place in God's church. We don't rejoice when we see other people doing wrong things, so we can keep bringing up such deeds to blackmail them, to indicate how God really has given them misfortune. We don't rejoice at their problems as if they earned them. Number 11, love rejoices with the truth. Loving people do not try to lie their way out when faced with the truth, but accept responsibility for what they've done. For they know that in the end, Jesus, who is the way and the truth of the life, will have his way. I think one of the things I see most often in counseling, particularly in married couples, is that when they're speaking to each other, there's 2 postures people have. When someone brings up an offense and the other person listens and doesn't immediately rush to justify themselves or defend themselves, that's a loving thing to do. Now, is it always truthful what they bring up? No, it's not. Sometimes it's perception. But to listen, as Proverbs 18 will bring out, means I'm looking for wisdom and knowledge and understanding about how I respond. But if the first thing I'm doing is defending myself, I am not loving, is what he's saying. I'm not rejoicing in unrighteousness. I'm sorry, I'm rejoicing with the truth. Now, there could be shades of the truth. And again, a wise person doesn't rush to defend themselves, but listens. And then we walk through the scenario together in a peaceful manner. But otherwise, I forget who Jesus is. Number 12, keeps every confidence. Loving people are willing to overlook the foibles of others and do not betray them. When someone tells you a particular thing in confidence, and you say, gee, so and so ought to know that. No, when we make a promise to be confidential, other than there's specific caveats even in the counseling room. There are times when you can't be always confidential, and we can. If you wonder what those are, I can be glad to share you with them. We have a what's called a consent form to do that. Because you want to know what you're signing up for when you meet with someone. It's mostly, you can be guaranteed confidentiality, except when you're a harm to yourself or you're a harm to others, or there's an issue that results in some issue related to church discipline, like it's a sin that's going unrepented. But in the main, you can expect confidentiality. But what happens if someone betrays that, it's an unloving thing. It borders on gossip and slander. Because we actually only know what we've been told. We don't know all the truth behind all those things. And so we get a little bit ahead of ourselves. Number 13, believes all things. And the idea here is someone who trusts. Loving people never lose their faith in other people and give up on them, but remain faithful to them in spite of their shortcomings. Again, what I see in marriage counseling when they've been together a long time, sometimes 10, 20, and 30, 40 years of issues that have gone on. There's no forgiveness, there's no confrontation, there's no confession, there's no getting the log out of my own eye. It's all about you, and this. But what Paul is saying here is that love hopes all things. Love believes all things. And loving people look for the best, not bringing up the negative all the time, and they never lose their faith in other people. The number of people who seek counseling usually wait for counseling to be the final straw. Like, I tried counseling, it didn't work. Well, you tried it for 5 minutes. They get to the spot where they've been hurt so many times that they lose faith. But in the losing of faith, I actually lose my love for the other person. It actually goes both ways. The person who continues to do this thing, of course, is not loving, but the person then who loses faith, who loses hope, who loses trust, is also not loving anymore. I've lost my love for the other person because now it's all about me and what I'm justly deserved. Believes all things. Number 14, hopes all things. Loving people keep looking ahead to better days, for they know that God has sent his Spirit to work out his will in people. This is coming from Philippians chapter 2 and chapter 3. We keep looking ahead for better days. We believe all things, that is, we trust because we trust in the one who's given us the power to overcome temptation and sin. We hope all things because the same God who helps me believe helps me look forward to what's coming in that great day. And number 15, loving people endures all things. Loving people stand firm in the midst of trials and hardships and do not give up the ship. Are all problems and trials easy? May it never be. They are not easy, right? Some are difficult. Will shake you to your core. And yet loving people stand in the midst of those trials, trusting, hoping, believing. And finally, number 16, love never fails. Failing means here to move with relative rapidity in a downward direction, to fall. And some of your versions may even say love never falls. And both are appropriate. To collapse, to fall to pieces. Paul wants us to be sure that there will never be a situation in which love is the wrong way to act by causing to fall. We don't want to see the idea that our love for someone else can just let them go and let them fail and fall. Love never fails. And so there's this idea of permanence of love is what's being described, and we've described all the ways that love can occur between people. 16 different verbs, 16 different ways. And what happens is the end of this thing, where love never fails, starts to act like a bridge to go to the next section. Love never falls or love never fails is an overarching statement about the nature and the permanence of a God-sustained, God-controlled love. A person-controlled love will fall and fail, usually about day 92 of your marriage. That was supposed to be funny, but apparently not. But this verse acts like a bridge, saying, if love is characterized by never failing and never falling, what does that mean for us? Never collapsing, never fading is an attribute of love. And if it fades away, it wasn't love. So now the point is to contrast the never failing love with gifts, which will fade, which brings us to the next section. So that's gifts that pass away, verse 8b. Love never fails, but if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away with. And if there are tongues, they will cease. And if there's knowledge, it will be done away with. Now, just very quickly, just a simple chart, which is almost taking the words you just read and just putting them together. Prophecy will be done away with. Tongues, they will cease. Knowledge, it's done away with. This idea of, I need some knowledge from other source in order to validate what God would have me know and do and think. I need some tongue to explain to me in a language I understand, using not the speaker's native language, but my native language. I need that tongue to be able to tell me what God has for me, what God has planned. I need a prophecy which will occur. And what Paul is saying, that while love never fails or love never falls, tongues, prophecy, and knowledge will cease. Because at some point in time, because the perfect will come, which we get into verse 10, when the perfect comes, there is no need for these other temporary things to shore us up. And yet, by God's plan and his design, those gifts have been given to give us help, to give us knowledge, to give us instruction. But at some point in time, these extraordinary gifts will no longer be necessary. Cease and done away with are just analogous for each other. They will all three stop. The question is, when? And I think there are only a couple valid choices. When there's no longer a need for the church to know the essential truths needed for life and godliness, or when Jesus returns. Now that's going to bring us to the next section. But notice that what Paul says, while the gifts you may have fade away in terms of the church at some point in time, even when you get to heaven, do you think you have the same gifts that you have today? No. You're in the presence of Jesus. You don't need more knowledge. You don't need more prophecy. You don't need more tongues. Christ will speak to you in ways that you need to be able to hear and know and understand. So when we get to heaven, the need for that ceases. But someday on earth, that need ceases too. Love never falls. Love never says, Jesus will always love you, whether you're here, there, or in the air. But prophecy, tongues, and knowledge will go away. Right, so that brings us to the next section. Now and later. So this is broken up into two parts. First of all, I know in part, verses 9 to 11. For we know in part and prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away with. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child, and when I became a man, I did away with childish things. Now, this is one of those passages that you could spend a couple weeks or a PhD dissertation on. You choose. So we're not going to solve it for the ages today, but these final verses in 13 compare the present age with the one to come. If we've been talking about the present, at which there are many gifts and there are many descriptions for the way that love should interact in your heart to bind your conscience to act according to the will of God for people, using your gifts for their betterment, then what's going to happen is someday that need will cease because there's another thing having replaced it. And that's Jesus' own presence. These final verses in 13 compare the present age with the one to come. The first illustration is of a child maturing into adulthood and putting away childish things. And so he says then, again, when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away with. So there's three ways to look at this. What does the perfect mean? Again, I'm not going to explain a great deal on this. I'm going to give a 3-minute summary. But no, again, our standard, our position on the gifts and what's temporary, what's permanent, um, until Jesus comes is in our statement of faith. I think you all have a copy of that from last week, or it's in the doctrinal statement that's on either online or you probably got when you became a member. First of all, there's the canon view, C-A-N-O-N. Canon meaning the combination of what's the Word of God. The closing of the New Testament is kind of what's in view here. The perfect in these verses may refer to the closing of the canon of the New Testament rather than the return of Christ. People like John MacArthur and Robert Thomas and Sinclair Ferguson hold to this view, as does, this is really where our church resides as well. There's also the Parousia view, meaning Parousia meaning the coming, the return of Christ. For this view takes the idea of when the perfect comes is the Parousia, when Christ comes back to earth, and we receive our heavenly bodies then, and when we receive our perfect bodies when Jesus comes back, and we receive, or we get taken into the new heavens and the new earth. Richard Gaffin takes that view, the Parousia view, that it's the return of Christ that's in view. And there's a third view called the body view. As the body matures, it no longer needs the immature things to buoy it or sustain it, which is a polite way to say, I'm not going to make a position whether it's then or later, or now or later. It's just then, whenever then is. So it's like just forestalls the conversation somehow. John MacArthur says the cessation of tongues took place a short while after the Paul wrote this letter. And this is the position of B.B. Warfield, who took this position. He was a professor at Princeton, and he wrote some wonderful things, especially about inerrancy and the inspiration of the Word of God. But B.B. Warfield took this position a little over 100 years ago. Cessationism is the view that the sign gifts have faded from the scene of historical Christianity with the fading away of the apostles. And cessationism was the predominant view until about 100 years ago. Again, we won't have time to go into all the history of that. But even in the Old Testament, signs were a fixture to authenticate the messenger and the coming of the prophets. They were not a permanent fixture throughout all of Israel's history. Sign gifts only occurred when someone needed to say, is this prophet from God or not? Miracles highly correlate to the rise and fall of prophets. The more prophets you had speaking, the more miracles there were to say, this is my prophet. You can trust in him. And when the prophets faded from the scene, as would happen over time, as you see the chronology of the Old Testament, when those prophets faded from the scene, miracles ceased. So they came and they went, and they came and they went. When there were few prophets, miracles ground to a halt until God raised up another prophet. And again, as I mentioned last week, our church takes a cessationist perspective. That means we hold the canon view, as Thomas indicated above. And there are nuances to the cessationist view. Even though we believe the gifts of healing have faded from the scene, it does not mean that God does not heal. Anybody know someone who's ever been healed of something in a miraculous way? I have, but that's just me. I'm hoping, I guess I'm alone. Not the first time I've been alone, but it does not mean that God does not heal. However, the very absence of the number of healers and the absence of the consistent healings by any so-called healer. In other words, by its very definition, if someone has the gift of healing, that when they put their hands on somebody and they're meant to be healed and not have a repeat healing or a partial healing. It's meant to be permanent and for God's glory. And the fact that nobody's doing that, let alone there are very few people who call themselves healers, leads you to believe that until 100 years ago, that was the predominant view. And so we take history to be indicative of that. The same can be said of tongues, of prophetic or future utterances, and so on. God can and does bring about aspects of the events, just not a normal course of doing business. So back to the verses. God's plan is for some growth from immaturity, but the nature of becoming mature means that the immature goes away. Likewise, sign gifts will go away when which is the issue, and love will always be with us. That's his point in these verses. Right, that was a long way to say that, wasn't it? Verses 12 and 13, kind of as we start to land this plane. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I have been fully known. But now faith, hope, and love remain, these three. So what do we mean by that? The second illustration leverages mirrors and seeing dimly versus seeing something face to face. The irony here is that Corinth was the producer of some of the finest bronze mirrors in antiquity. They produced mirrors that you could see your reflection quite well. So Paul's leveraging the thing that they produce to say, you know how you see yourself in a mirror and it looks somewhat dimly because it's just not accurate and it's not polished to complete perfection. And yet when you see someone face to face, you go, I recognize the similarity, much better this way. He's using that illustration to say, this is the way that history will work. Now we see dimly, later on we'll see as if face to face. Later on we won't have a mirror that's only polished so far, then we'll see perfectly face to face. So he leverages that fact that they didn't have polished mirrors that we have today that lets us see fairly easily or fairly precisely what we look like. Now, in the day of perfection, verse 10, we will know perfectly. We will have reached the conclusion. Our present view of God is just a fog compared to the fuller vision and understanding we'll have in the time to come. So to conclude, the immature and mature, we only need faith in the unseen and hope for the future until what was by faith is before us and what is hoped for is realized. In other words, even faith and hope will fade away. Why will faith and hope fade away? Because I will be in the presence of Jesus. I no longer have to hope that I will see him. He's standing right there. I no longer have to have faith in the unseen things to say God will find a way because he is faithful. I will see him standing there. So faith and hope will fade away. Everybody get that? Right. But what does not fade away? Love. So this brings us to the final verse. The greatest of these is love, therefore pursue love. The final part of chapter 13 acts as a bridge. So we had this bridge in verse 31 to say, let me show you the more perfect way. The more perfect way, exercise love and all the 15 ways that we talked about. Now, as we conclude this, we find the same kind of return and the same emphasis. The final part of chapter 13 acts as a bridge to bring us back to where we started. Gifts were being misused, as we saw in chapter 12, but love, which must govern how gifts are used, will continue on. It is the greatest of the attributes that God passes on to us and expects us to leverage our gifts in light of love and the expressions of love. So that brings us to an application. What do we mean by that? All right. This chapter is frequently abused in the sense of being taken out of context. As we saw in the introduction, the contextual question that Paul is trying to answer is, how and why do we exercise the gifts that God has given us as the body of Christ? We don't exercise it out of selfish control, out of selfish desire, in all the 15, 16 ways that we talked about in verses 4 to 8. We exercise it with a view towards, how do I build someone up? How am I patient with them? How am I kind with them? And so we've been told to eagerly desire the greater gifts. But under what circumstances do we often hear the sermon about love? Marriage. You had to know I was going to bring that in some other time. Now, I want to be careful whom I offend here. Love is a universal, it is an attribute of God which he passes on to his creation. It was one of God's communicable attributes, and I would argue that more than the conscious being an indication that there's a divine creation. As we read in Psalm 19, what I would argue is that love is probably even more so. Why is it we can love one another is because we've been given the capacity to love by our great Creator. And so love is the greater thing. From that perspective, when love is described in this chapter, it's not improper to apply its inherent qualities to marriage. But the primary emphasis in any passage when you're looking to interpret it is what's the main point that this passage played in its context. So between chapter 12, which was about what? All right, I didn't mean to throw a pop quiz on you that rush. What was chapter 12 about? Spiritual gifts. What's chapter 14 about? Sounds like mutual myths. It's spiritual gifts again. So if you got chapter 12 about spiritual gifts, chapter 14 about spiritual gifts, what do you think 13's about? Spiritual gifts. But doing it with love. Doing it with the capacity to see someone else built up in this most holy faith. His final conclusion is to pursue it. It's an imperative. It means something we need to strive for, to seek after, to aspire to something. If we don't do that, then we're nothing. And that's by God's design, even. We need to pursue it, strive for it, seek after it, aspire to it, because it is how we reflect God's glory and his provision for us of these gifts he's been given when we exercise it to build someone else up and not tear them down. Let's close in prayer. Father, again, we thank you for your word and the power it is to us to see the position of love. Lord, expand our hearts, expand our understanding, expand our desire. Help us to seek it, to pursue it, to give all that we have to get it, that we might build one another up in this most holy faith, and you be glorified in our midst, in our presence, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.